Good evening. This is KGNU Boulder, 88.5 FM with translator K260AC in Fort Collins, Colorado at 99.9 megahertz, and translator K229AC in Ward, Colorado at 93.7 megahertz. Coming up now, we have Hemispheres. Welcome to Hemispheres for this Tuesday, February 4th. Election Day in Boulder. If you haven't thought about that and you live in the city of Boulder and are a registered voter, this is your chance to express your opinions about where the city's going. This evening on Hemispheres, we'll be speaking with Professor Joel Edelstein, a regular to Hemispheres listeners and professor of political science at the University of Colorado at Denver. Joel's just returned from a 5-week?
1 month.
1 month. month-long trip to Chile. We'll be taking your calls a little later in this evening also if you have any questions for Joel about his observations of life down south. So, Joel, what was the formal purpose of this trip?
Well, Chile is thought of as, well, just to go back a bit, I've been studying global political economy, the implications of increased economic integration on a global scale for several years, and my background comes out of looking at problems of development. And if you go back 30 years, most of the countries of the third world were poor countries. They didn't have much manufacturing. They just produced, what they mined, or a few, sugar, bananas, coffee, things like that, around the world. And what we've seen is that some countries have really taken off as kind of mini manufacturing powers. The East Asian tigers, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, for example. And they have really boosted their income, a lot of economic growth. For example, this year, Singapore, which was a poor country, dirt poor country 30 years ago, surpassed Colorado in per capita income. That Singapore now has a little over $24,000 a year per capita income. That's what Colorado is. And they say by the year 2000, they will hit $30,000 a year per capita income and leave Colorado in the dust.
Putting us to shame.
Well, I don't know about shame, but they're going to have more money to spend than we have to spend. And so a lot of countries would like to be the fifth tiger. Chile considers itself not a tiger, but a jaguar, because that's the South American tiger. And it has had an economic growth rate of over 7% for the last 10 years. Unemployment went from 40 or 50% down to about 5 or 6%. Poverty was, I don't know how high, I don't have that figure, but they've got it down to 28% now. And so it is talked about as the economic miracle, and they've done it through a military dictatorship, a brutal military dictatorship that overthrew the Popular Unity Socialist government of Salvador Allende back in 1973. And they have been very successful in growing the economic pie. And I went to look this economic model in the face and see, well, what's the truth of it? Is it working? Who is it working for? Is it sustainable? What does it mean in terms of people's lives? And I left Boulder on December 27th, and I returned on January 28th.
And what did you find?
Well, the growth is there. The low unemployment is real. I spent about a little over 3 weeks of my time in Santiago, in the capital. This is a country of 14 million people, and the capital has about 4.5 million of them. And that's where most things happen. And I interviewed economists, people on the left, people involved in the anti-NAFTA struggle, the director of a women's center who also, for now anyway, is the program director, the station manager of a radio station that this women's center has called Radio Tierra. And people involved in a variety of things. I also interviewed a guy who is the head of one of the largest companies, private companies in the country, who is about to become the head, by now he probably is, the head of the largest state company. So I got some variety of views and talked to middle-class people. I lived with a family where a guy who has a degree in sociology but can't get a job in sociology. And so he's working for a private insurance company. There's a lot of that. And what I found is that Chile, in many respects, is becoming more like the United States. Progressive people decry the loss of human solidarity, the loss of a sense of meaning, really, as people work more and more for material things. The working class people are able to buy more things than they could before, by and large, although they're not well-to-do. I mean, the pie has been growing in Chile, and the inequality in the distribution of that pie has been growing as well.
A phenomenon we're familiar with here at home.
Yeah, very much so.
It makes one question the value of those economic statistics, the growth of an economy and such. If it doesn't mean anything in the lives of people, of what use is it?
Well, it does. This per capita GDP is a horrendous measure. I mean, it's used here and in international circles to talk about human progress. You know, how we judge a presidency. Clinton was saying Bush was a failed president because economic growth in his administration was the lowest of any presidency since the Great Depression or something like that. What does it mean? The GDP is a figure that simply measures economic activity. For example, if we produce more hospital goods and that produces more health, that will increase the GDP. But if we hire more police and build more prisons, that increases the GDP too. If there's a big earthquake and it destroys cities and there's billions of dollars spent to rebuild the cities, that contributes to GDP. People get divorces. They have to sell the house. The pay to the lawyers increases the GDP. Selling the house does too. Paying for the therapist for the kids, that increases the GDP as well. So this is a figure that doesn't measure the quality of people's lives at all. But it is true in Chile that they have and it's a maximum trickle-down model. That's the whole thing, has been concentrating income at the top. It's what Ronald Reagan devoted the United States to doing, and other presidents since have continued, is try and get more and more of the wealth to the rich, more of the income to the rich, with the idea that they will not spend the money on consumption because they already are consuming as fast as they can, and instead they'll invest that money, and that investment will create jobs, and those jobs will bring a higher standard of living for workers.
How did you find people referring to this? We call it Reaganomics. In Europe, they call it Thatcherism.
Right. I think the main term that's used in development circles and in the third world it's called neoliberalism.
Oh, I was wondering about just the people you ran into.
Yeah, in
did
Chile
they have a
talk
colloquialism?
about the neoliberal model.
So they're okay.
And people were, on opinion surveys, 60% say this model is only working for the rich. It's not working for us. But people are buying in. And they are, while you have many fewer people unemployed than there used to be, having a job doesn't predict whether you're going to be poor or not. The working poor is a category that has grown very substantially. And the credit card debt has grown. All you need in Chile to get a credit card, I guess it's like here too, where college students who aren't even working will get credit cards in the mail with a $500 limit on them or something like that. Consumer debt's over $4 billion in this country of 14 million now. If you earn $158 a month and you've held your job for 6 months, you can get a credit card. The average household has 2.7 credit cards now. And people are working 2 jobs to pay off their plastic debt for all of the things that they've bought.
Which also sounds like home, doesn't it?
Yeah. And as a result of this, again, a lot of people are happy to have things they never had before, even though alcoholism is up, suicide is up, divorce is up, child abuse is up. All of those things, many say, as a result of the stress of trying to pay off the debts in getting hold of those consumer goodies.
The description that you're painting for us here sounds very much like home. And I wonder if we're going to have to get used to some other way of thinking about what was the first world and the third world.
Well, I think that's definitely in order. I mean, this was my first trip to Chile, and so I really can't compare it with what things were like before this neoliberal model, let's say, going back to the days of the Allende government or before that in the 1960s. But so much of what is attractive to me personally in Latin American societies, in Mexico, in Nicaragua, in Cuba, that sense of human solidarity, that kind of openness that people have, that people are not focused on running to make a dollar, but rather are more attentive to their extended families, to kind of cultivating friendships, that sense of openness of people on the street is really, I found, not very present in Chile.
That's interesting. Have religious trends in Chile been changing along with that? Did you run into any conversation about that?
Yeah, certainly talked about it, and there really has not been. Chile has about 10% of the population now has taken on one of the Protestant evangelical faiths that are so critically important now in Central America. Guatemala is at least 25% now. Chile, it got to 10% and just sort of stopped. Catholicism is very powerful and very, very conservative. During the dictatorship, the years of the dictatorship from 73, when Pinochet came into power, until 89, when the regime was voted out, the church played a progressive role in making space to protect political dissent. I mean, you couldn't do much, but the church did what could be done. And they also fed starving people. They were feeding 10% of the population in most of the 70s and into the 80s. But their positions, for example, I mean, Chile comes across in many respects as a very modern place. I mean, the technology, 2 sectors have really been developed. One is banking and finance, and the other is telecommunications. So that there's certainly more ATM machines per square mile in Chile than you find in the United States. And telephones are all fiber optic. And you have this sense of modernity. But Chile is, I think, the last Western country in which divorce is illegal.
Oh, that is interesting.
And
It's still illegal.
a bill was introduced into the legislature while I was there that would allow for divorce. And the argument about it is very loud, and the church is pushing very hard against legalizing divorce.
Which raises, I think, the larger political issue about the change since '89. Did you get the sense that people do think that something substantially is different now, that Pinochet runs the military but not the country?
People feel that Chile has gone through a transformation because of what's happened to the economy. And there are Chileans who were known in the past as a very humble people, really, rather self-effacing. And if you wanted to find arrogance, go next door to Argentina. find plenty there. Has very strong personalities, and some of those generalizations really hold. But in Chile, that has been changing, and Chileans are becoming arrogant. We are, the leaders of Latin America now. I mean, in fact, Chile has now got about $8 billion, U.S. type dollars, of investment in other Latin American countries. And Chile is becoming an investor country, buying up telephone systems elsewhere, getting into electric power, and a number of other things. And it affects the way Chileans think of themselves.
And how much different is that?
But I didn't get to your question about the change in '89 politically. At the time, Chileans thought that they had brought back democracy and that they had made a fundamental break. Now I think there is a questioning about that because this, a number of things. One, the economic model has not been changed. And very, very little has actually changed since the military left power and a civilian coalition came into power. The labor law, for example, is the same labor law as under Pinochet. And it makes it impossible for unions to negotiate contracts other than on a single factory basis, which means the unions are completely impotent. Before, they were impotent because of massive, brutal repression. Torture, disappearances, and so on. That slowed down at the late 70s. It then increased again in the mid-80s. But now you will not be disappeared for being a union leader. You might be fired, but you won't be disappeared. But still, unions cannot be effective. Workers do not have any power. They really don't have any rights. They don't have any protections against being fired, for example, without cause. So that hasn't changed even though civilians are in power. The income distribution, the level of inequality, has continued to increase. That is, Chile is more unequal today, significantly, than it was when Pinochet and the military regime left power in 1989. And the Chilean military has impunity. They are the only instances in which murderers and torturers have been put into prison from the period of the dictatorship are two cases that the United States pressed. One of them was the bomb assassination of Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Carpen Moffett in the streets of Washington, D.C., in a bomb that was placed by the Chilean intelligence services and the CIA. And there are some people in jail over that in Chile. And one other case. Other than that, nobody has been punished. And they don't talk about it, even. The military still, the president of the country who is elected is not the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. General Pinochet controls the armed forces and appoints who's going to be appointed and does not in any way have to report to the president of the country. And the military can, and they have, thrown people in jail for defaming the military.
This arrangement for General Pinochet, this understanding I had at the time these arrangements were being made is that this was something special to Pinochet. Is that true, or would his successor enjoy that same autonomy?
No, the laws haven't been changed. There's talk about about coming up with a new constitution. Chile is functioning under the 1980 constitution that Pinochet put into place through a plebiscite. And there's talk about a new constitution that would do away with the special powers of the military. But the politicians seem to be afraid of the military.
Which would make sense after all those years.
Yeah, although what kind of democracy is this? I mean, there's 8 or 9 senators, and the body has over 100, so it's not that significant, who are not elected, but they are designated by the military. And they are Pinochetistas, who are as far right as you can get. And the right in the country supports this role of the military. Not only can the military try people in military courts for defaming them. And they did put in jail for a couple of days the executive secretary of the Communist Party for having said bad things about the military. And they've done that before. But also the military continues to get 10% off of the top of the copper industry. I mean,
Which is still nationalized or
yes.
mostly nationalized?
The private sector in mining is growing, but still a majority of it is in state hands, and 10% of their earnings off the top go to the military without going through the civilian government at all.
It is shocking. This, and you mentioned this just briefly before, this is a country that we're in negotiations with now to have the same relationship that we have with Mexico and Canada, the Super NAFTA they're calling it.
Absolutely. And for U.S. workers have to compete with workers in a country where those workers have no rights and no protections is a subversion of the position of U.S. workers.
Well, before we talk about what the people in Chile told you about what they thought they could or should do with this situation, but before we came on the air, you were putting together some statistics for us about this income distribution problem.
Yeah, basically, just to give you a contrast, the top 5% of the population, the richest 5% of the population in Chile, receives 33%. That's just about a third of all income. 5% receive 33%.
So we're not talking about what they own.
We're not
This
talking
is
about
just
wealth. This is
salaries.
income, salaries. They bring in, it's about $14,800 a year per person in that top 5%. So a family of 5, we're talking about an average of about $74,000 a year. The poorest 5% of the population gets less than 1/2 of 1% of the national wealth. It's the richest 5% gets 72 times what the poorest 5% does. And they bring in about $18 a month per person, about $220 a year, so that a family of 6, and the families at the bottom tend to be larger, would have about $110 a month for a family of 6 to live on.
What can you tell us about what it costs to live?
Yeah, I was just going to get to that. Housing is probably in the vicinity of maybe half of what it costs around here.
Being Boulder in particular?
Yeah, something like that. I went to a house that was, it cost there about $150,000. I think here it would likely be in the neighborhood of, given its location and everything, maybe twice that. And rents are not as high as they are here. So you would save, your housing dollar would go further in Chile. If you're out in the countryside, it would go still further than that. But if you are, as most people are, if you are not producing, you're not growing what you eat. If you're going to the supermarket for your food, the prices are approximately what they are here. If you're not making your own clothes, but you're going to the store to buy them, they're probably somewhat more expensive than they are here. And that goes for appliances as well.
What did it cost just if you're out running around during the day to get lunch? Sandwich, Coke?
I'd say in Santiago, in the neighborhood, a cheap lunch you could get for maybe $4. And more normally it would be around $5.50, $6. And if you went to the central market, where it's actually the prices in the seafood restaurants, that's my favorite place to go, are lower than they are in the rest of the city, then you could have a really nice lunch, an incredible lunch. That would be a $40 lunch here, and there it would cost you maybe $12.
Interesting. Sounds like there are a lot of people getting by on not much money.
Yeah, very much so.
Is there any kind of social security system, social support network for the poor?
Um, well, Social Security and social support are are separate things, really. I mean, in terms of, there are programs aimed at reducing poverty, and poverty has been reduced to now they define poverty as people who earn less than or have less than twice what they consider the cost of a basic of your basic food necessities, what they call the canasta, which is your food basket. And the basic food basket, people who earn less than one basic food basket are considered desperately poor because that means they have not enough to eat.
But that wouldn't include their clothing or
No.
housing or
Right.
anything like that.
So these
That's
are
just
the
food.
desperately, absolutely poor. And they are about 8% of the population by official statistics. Then people who receive between the cost of one basic food basket and two basic food baskets. So in other words, they can buy the basic food and have something left over, although not that much, for everything else. They are considered poor, but not absolutely poor. And that's about 20% of the population.
20 plus the original 8 or
Right,
20
plus
more?
the original
Okay.
8, 20 more. But when you look
Wow.
at, let's say, the people who are in the 70 to 75th percentile, in other words, there's about a quarter to a third of the population is richer than them, and somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 are poorer than they are. So these are people that are kind of up there. They have that 5% of the population gets about 3.9% of the national income. So they're not getting as much as 5%.
Mm-hmm.
What it boils down to is $150 a month per person. For a family of 5, that would be $750 a month, or $87.50 a year.
And the vast majority of the population is below that.
Right. Yeah. So people are struggling to make it, and they've gotten to this far because they work 2 jobs.
Mm-hmm.
School teachers, secondary school teachers, there was a major strike toward the end of last year of school teachers. They make around $600 a month. And that's for a 5 to 6 hour day. Many of them work 2 jobs, so they're managing to come in with $1,200 a month, or $14,400 a year, by working 2 jobs. So you can imagine what their lives are like.
Yeah.
And
Well, that problem about people not having time to live.
yeah. And there's an educational reform that's taking place because in Chile it's been considered normal that the school day is only about 5 hours. And now they want to make it an 8 or 9 hour. A lot of the things that come from the right wing here are in practice in Chile. I mean, it's a great place to go to see the things that the right wants to do here, because they're already doing a lot of them in Chile. And they want to boost the school day, the school week, to about 42 hours. And what that will require is all Chilean schools now are geared to be on a double shift. And the teachers are basically geared to work 2 jobs. And by doing this, they're going to have to build 30,000 classrooms, because the schools, they're going to have to essentially double the number of schools they've got, because they're going to move from double shift to single per school, and they're going to have to pay the teachers more and have a lot more teachers in order to cover the longer school week.
Which, in principle, doesn't necessarily sound bad for teachers.
No.
But more chance to educate. Would they really be compensated for
Well,
losing their second job?
That's the question. And you asked about Social Security. Chile, in 1980, they privatized the Social Security system, so that
Right, something that they're trying to do here.
That's right. And we have, and most countries have, a pay-as-you-go system, where the money, by and large, that we put in from our paychecks now, that money is being used principally to provide the benefits for the people who have retired or the survivors of workers who have died. and the other things, disability that Social Security covers. And the argument they make, and I spoke with the guy who headed the largest of the private companies, and he's saying back in the 1940s there were 12 Chilean workers for every retired worker. In 1980 there were 2.5 workers for every retired worker, and pay-as-you-go systems are simply unsustainable, which is the same argument being made here, that we just don't have, that people are living longer, and so retired people are living longer, and we have a larger and larger part of the population who are older and retired relative to the people who are actively in the workforce.
That figure sounds fantastic, though. Going from 12 active workers to retired down to 2
Mm-hmm.
in 50 years. Does that seem plausible to you?
You know, I hadn't stopped to examine it.
I mean, I understand people are living longer, but in theory there'd be more people working in Chile because the unemployment rate is lower.
I wonder if the political events might have, for example, taken into exile and people who've not returned who would be in the workforce, who are economically active.
Oh yeah,
now.
or they were killed.
Or they were killed, right. So that the demographic pyramid in Chile is distorted from what it might otherwise be as a result of what's happened in its history since 1973.
Quite dramatically. Sounds like a situation where things could get ugly any day now. That many people living with that much poverty, in spite of what they call it.
But the poverty is less than it used to be. And I went to a barrio, a poblacion, they call them there, Victoria, which was dirt poor and very militant, I mean, solidly left. Major support for the socialist government back in the early 70s. And the streets are all named, you know, Salvador Allende and Unidad Popular and Karl Marx and so on and so forth. And there's still a tradition there. But where it used to be absolutely poor, in front of some of the houses, there are automobiles. And it's clear some people have built a second story on their houses. And they're becoming more mixed. And it used to be a place where I was told, and maybe this is just the image of middle-class people, but where sort of if you were middle class, you wouldn't go walking around in there. It was too dangerous to do, even in daylight. And I don't know that that's true, because I think that sounds to me, just on the sense of it, more of a middle class projection of fear than is really justifiable. But I don't know. I wasn't there. But that's not the case anymore, certainly.
So you don't get the impression of a bubbling cauldron.
Well, people may be bubbling, but they're bubbling inside their own skins. I mean, in the last election, there is a coalition of parties called the Concertación. The largest part of it is the Christian Democrats, and then there's socialists and a couple smaller parties, and they are the government. They got 56% of the vote in the election a couple of years ago. Last November, actually, in the local vote. The right, and when you talk about the opposition in Chile, you talk about the right, got 32%. The left, which used to get between 25 and 35% of the vote dependably, now is under 10%.
What percentage of the population is voting?
It's high. It's over 80%. Puts us to shame.
Wow.
I mean, they have a tradition that people vote in Chile. So people are not going away from the polls. They will say on opinion surveys that the system is really mainly benefiting the rich, but people do not see an alternative.
That is interesting.
And, I interviewed a lot of people on the left. Well, not a lot, but a number anyway. And, well, talking about that, I mean, there's one left weekly that remains. And I had trouble finding it. I interviewed the editor. Manuel Cabieses. It's called Punto Final, and it's high quality. Comes out every 2 weeks. But there's hardly any left media. The 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 centrists and the right have a hegemony.
I'm a little surprised to hear that there would be a left publication still in existence, given the years of the Pinochet dictatorship. Such things were allowed?
I don't know if I think probably not. I'm
Sure, they're
ignorant about
underground,
that.
yeah.
But I would guess that it did not publish during the years of the dictatorship, and it came back. That didn't come up in our conversation. Although one thing that did come up that I was reminded of was the fact that Chile has not processed the experience of the dictatorship at all. They haven't reflected upon it and what it means. And I mean, I did find that, for example, people who went into exile, a lot of them have trouble when they come back. There's a myth of exile that on the part of the people who stayed and were able to stay, that people in exile had lived in the lap of luxury. They didn't have the hardships that the people in Chile had living under the dictatorship and the terrible economic times. I mean, when the regime opened up to free trade and just pulled down the tariff barriers, their country deindustrialized because they couldn't compete. They recovered after a couple of years, and then the economy got better. Although through this, just as here, as productivity has increased, the incomes of the workers have not. They have some, but just as here, productivity increases are higher than wage increases. That's why the income gets to be so concentrated. I mean, it's a system and it's reinforced. What happens in the private sector economy in terms of inequality is reinforced by the government. There's virtually no income tax. There's a small income tax for people who are very rich, most of them evade it. Where the government gets its money is from a value-added tax. Or it's a kind of a sales tax. It's a value-added tax that's 18%.
And people in Boulder think it's bad at 7.25.
That's right.
Or 7.4 now, 7.41.
So 18%. It used to be 20. And on top of that, you have 20% of your salary taken out. 10% goes to this private Social Security. 3% goes to the private Social Security for administration of your money. So it's sort of like if you have mutual funds with a big front-end load or something they call it, where the mutual fund gets 3% of the money you give them to invest. That's the way it works in Chile. Then there's another 7% that's taken out for your health insurance and your survivor's benefits. So 20% of your income is taken out. And then when you purchase something, you pay another 18% in a sales tax. And as far as what you get for your health insurance, if you are patient, you may get something. But there was major strikes last year among nurses because the pay is so bad. People wait months in order to get medical procedures. The system is really squeezed.
And what are the wealthy doing?
In what terms?
To get around, is there a private market in healthcare?
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah.
So, well, I guess that brings us back to the question of what are they going to do?
Well, really, on the left, there isn't a sense. People will put forth proposals to deal with the very high concentration of income. And the government talks about it as a problem. Oh, we have a problem. The income is too concentrated. We need to do something about that. But they are committed to maintaining this trickle-down economic model, which concentrates the income and they're committed to workers not having any rights. I mean, what they say is workers can't have rights because capitalists have to have the flexibility to use workers in ways that will make money.
That sounds like you're awesome.
That's right.
You know, we should probably take a... So, another thing I kind of cheated when we were talking a little bit before the show was some of the other visions that exist, and it seemed to me that given the, whole Latin American milieu and the fact that Latin Americans at least keep up a little more with each other than perhaps we do, that more people in Chile would be talking about Cuba and the Cuban model.
Well, they certainly talk about Cuba was stimulated when there was the Latin American and Hispanic Summit was held in Santiago in December, and the heads of state of everywhere come for that, including Fidel. And there's a right-wing Cuban minority that exists in Chile, and Cubans from Miami came to protest against Fidel. And certainly there was graffiti. There were just major mobilizations of welcoming Fidel and condemning Fidel. What I found very broadly, and this includes, I didn't do a public opinion survey, but I was talking with middle-class people and not necessarily political people either. I mean, one couple, I went on a tourist trip to an incredible lake called the Lake of All Saints, the Lago de Todos los Santos, in the mountains in the south, and just magnificent countryside. It's kind of like the Pacific Northwest, a lot of precipitation and majorly green. And met some folks. There was two Chileans, a couple who live in Canada, but they just come back to vacation. It's clearly middle class. Another couple live in Brazil, but they come back home to visit. The middle class family I was living with, all of them tremendously admire Cuba. And they admire Cuba for caring for the people and for standing up against the United States, standing up to the United States, and maintaining their principles and maintaining their commitment to the poor in Cuba, in spite of all the pressure that the United States brings. And I think Chile cheers for Cuba. The right, I'm sure, doesn't feel that way, but two-thirds of Chileans certainly do. And now Chileans who have the money, you can see in the travel agencies all around the country, places I visited anyway, have advertisements for your 6 nights and 7 days in Havana, all or at Varadero Beach, all costs included package tour kind of thing, and Chileans are certainly enjoying the Cuban beaches.
But they're not talking about adopting a Cuban strategy for solving their own problems.
I don't think they're very informed about exactly what Cuba is doing in terms of, and Cuba is, they still have a vision of Cuba as kind of centralized state socialism. And the dynamic element in the Cuban economy is the foreign investment, and that's not something that most Chileans are aware of. I mean, Cuba has not really figured out yet how to grow and give a dynamic energy to their domestic economy in a way which is socialist. And the Cuban economy is recovering. I mean, they had a higher rate of growth last year than Chile did. They had like an 8.5% rate of growth in Cuba, and I mean, they're really pulling out of the dive they were in. It's a great thing to see. But a major dynamic of that is foreign investment.
Well, okay. I suppose if people in Chile aren't aware of the technical details of how that works, maybe they don't find it so inspiring. But just on a basic level, it would seem that the idea that people could come together to control their economy, that's what democracy is all about, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I would expect that some of that, just in its, broad strokes, would, find resonance with the Chilean people.
I think it does. I think that Cuba um, has a big space in the hearts of many Chileans, but that in terms of putting that into a political calculus, um, if the Communist Party represents the Cuban way, Chileans are not voting for it.
And what about the tradition that would stem from Salvador Allende himself? Does that remain at all? You mentioned people talking about him, obviously remembering him, but is there active discussion about how to recapture some of those ideas?
Well, actually, I mean, there's been a real effort to rewrite history and to make it to blame the Unidad Popular of Salvador Allende, that coalition government, the socialist government, for the Pinochet dictatorship, and to say that there was too much disorder. The mobilization of the masses in the streets was simply intolerable, and that was the fault of the Allende government for encouraging it and blaming the Allende government for the brutality of the Pinochet regime.
Which seems predictable for the Pinochet regime to do,
Mhm.
to justify itself by demonizing its ideological enemies, but it wasn't that long ago.
Well, it was 24 years ago now. And I think that people are afraid. I mean, this model with, you can say that there's a tremendous amount of stress, that people are working very hard, working long hours, but they're consuming more than they consumed before. And the rate of growth in the country, just the kind of transformation, even if most of the benefit is going to the rich, when you look at what a basket case so much of Latin America is, the Chileans are very happy to be where they are.
I suppose if you're running around all the time, you don't have much time to think about the alternatives.
Yeah, and people, I think, have come to question their values, to say, why is it, do I really feel that it's more important to have the time with my family and so on than it is to accumulate and develop things that in the past meant that we were doing really well.
And we have Daryl from Denver with us.
Hi.
Hi there.
I have a question about where the economic growth is. I know that Chile for a long time had a lot of extractive industries, gas, maybe oil in the south, and they were selling off their timber, and I know that you buy Chilean fruits, even wines, in the grocery stores in the U.S. today. Is that the extent of it, or are they doing light industry?
Good question. They're really doing very little with light industry. This is essentially they're selling natural resources. 40% of their exports, and it is an export-oriented model, are copper. That's down from 80% that it was 25 years ago, but it's still 40%. And then next comes fish meal and other fish products, followed by logging, cellulose, and other forestry products, and then fruits and wine. And I bought a shirt in Santiago. Of course, it was made in the Philippines. And I talked to an economist who's an advisor to several labor unions, and he said, there's no way that anybody can really compete in the production of cloth with China and a couple of the other countries. Maybe in terms of design and tailoring and sewing, we might be able, but not in the basic production of cloth.
So should I infer from that then that the increased GNP means an increase in the absolute level of exports of raw materials?
Yes, very definitely. I mean, that's where it's really coming from.
The next question is, how long can that go on?
Good question. There is some of the largest mines, and those are owned by the government, are expected to be exhausted over the next 20 to 50 years. Some of them as soon as 20 years. But there is...
You're talking about the copper deposits in the north of the country.
Chuquicamata, Teniente. I mean, there's 4 really big ones.
And they're all in the same one area, aren't they?
No. I know that one of the major ones is south of Santiago,
Huh.
sort of east of Temuco.
And it's
then,
tougher as well?
yeah, and then a couple of the other large ones are way up north. So they're not all in the same place. But there's new reserves that are being sought and being brought online. Um, Canadian money has moved into the tune of, I think, about $2 billion into mining. And so there will be new production coming online.
So what causes the employment then? Because extractive industries tend to not employ that many people.
That's true. It is in, well, there have been in fishing, there is an artisan fishing industry in addition to the factory ships. And sustainability is a question there. Some species of fish have clearly been overfished, and it's expected that they will be banning the catch of those species because they're close to gone. And they've allowed in U.S., particularly factory ships, that have really been clearing out some species. In terms of the forestry, I'm not sure what their logging practices are and how sustainable that is. But certainly it's a wooded country, at least in the south, and they've got quite a bit to go. In terms of where the employment, I think a lot of it is coming from there, but also the service sector has grown. Banking and finance have grown a lot. There are about 5 million people in the workforce. 25,000 of those 5 million are selling the private insurance, the private Social Security insurance, which is a surprisingly large part of the workforce. It's a very competitive industry, and most of them are not doing very well at all. You have, certainly a lot of McDonald's, and Kentucky Fried Chicken is there, and Pizza Hut, and as well as Chilean variants of fast food industry. So that the service sector is very significant as well.
That kind of goes with the two-job economy, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think there's more meals being eaten away
But
from home
did
as a
you
result.
get a sense that there was very much concern for the environment and taking a long-term view, or are they ready to plow up the farm so they can keep the mortgage paid?
The sense I get is that and I don't have a very strong sense of it, that certainly there is an environmental movement in Chile. I don't think that it has, there's a kind of basic level of awareness, but this model is really premised upon letting the market do its thing. And that is, to a great extent, what's happening. Santiago is an extremely, it's got its problem with inversion. It's in a bowl, and has a very bad pollution problem. They do have some regulation in terms of no drive days. So some of that exists, but in terms of the extractive industries, that is really the mainstay. That's the dynamic sector of the economy, followed by finance and telecommunications.
Now, how with telecom? They sold off the telephone company in the 70s. That's been privatized for a very long time. What else do they have there then in telecom?
Well, there's just major competition from all kinds of long-distance companies. It is a very competitive industry.
Now, are they? Is it just for? Are they like doing telecom in all the rest of South America, or just in Chile?
In terms of the Chilean company, it's CTC is the name of the major company, but Bell South is there and a whole bunch of others. In terms of whether Chilean telecommunications is operating outside, I really don't know.
And Daryl, we have another call here.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your question, Daryl.
Hi, Rick. Are you with us?
Hi. Yeah, I know I've only got like a minute or to go here, and I just wanted to say that I've really enjoyed hearing. It's Joel, right?
That's right, yeah.
His comments about Chile, because I just spent about a year in Chile and Bolivia, and found everything extremely accurate. In fact, just to touch on the last point about the Chilean effect on other countries, is in Bolivia it was very active during the time I was there last spring. The Bolivians bombed one of their, I think it was Land Chile's, one of their vehicles, and there was quite a bit of protests going on about it, and it made me fear for what Chile was, the impact that they were having on the rest of South America. But just quickly, I wanted to find out, because you are so knowledgeable about the subject, if you were had any published or planning to publish any information about what you've learned in Chile.
This is really, for me, part of a search for an alternative. I've been looking at development questions now for, I guess, 31 years, and I don't know what the alternative to neoliberalism is. I've got some ideas, and this trip is in part a search for that, and I hope over the next 3 years or so to be able to write something that addresses that question in a way that might make some contribution. In terms of whether I'll write something about Chile in between, I'm not sure. I'm in the process of producing a slideshow, which brings out a lot of what we've talked about this evening, illustrated with slides, and I may expand that into an article. I haven't really decided yet.
Well, Rick, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll look forward to hearing about that slideshow in the future.
Fine. We'll try and set up a public showing.
Thank you.
Joel, in the last couple of minutes that we have, there's one thing that I think is, sort of overriding people's awareness of South America these days, and that would be the Tupac Amaru seizing the Japanese ambassador's residence in Peru. What did you hear about that while you were so close?
I think that Chile is so North American in some respects. They look on that and kind of, I think, maybe feel a little bit superior because well, on the one hand they do, on the other hand, there was a prison break in early January, a very daring prison break, probably involved inside help because these folks rented a helicopter and flew it over the high security prison, and in a period of less than 3 minutes got 4 prisoners who were part of a revolutionary group that were in prison for having kidnapped and, I guess, assassinated a right-wing figure about 5 years ago. Gotten those 4 out of prison, and they had it down. They landed the helicopter in a park a few miles away where they had a getaway car. Then they split up into other getaway cars, and they have not been found. And the first thing that President Frey did was to introduce a new anti-terrorism law in the legislature. Now, this was not terrorism. This was a prison break.
Yeah.
But the response is, we've got to deal with these terrorists and restrict the rights of the population. So much in Chile is familiar to North Americans.
It sounds like I saw a movie along those very lines. Helicopter landing in a prison, taking people away. Must be where they got the idea.
Maybe so.
Well, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Well, it's good talking with you.
This is Hemispheres on KGNU Boulder, regular feature of Tuesdays from 6 to 7. My name's Richard Curtis. I've been your host this evening, and we've been speaking with Secret here, one of my co-producers, Dr. Joel Edelstein. Coming up next, we have Accordion Day.